Oh, oops. That's my bad.
Oh.
I have a few thoughts, but want to hold off to see what others have in terms of some requests of impact justice or how we want to work with them.
So I don't have thoughts on what specific information we would want to get from them. I do think that there may be some questions that come up as we go on with our discussions. I've been incredibly impressed by the sort of wealth of knowledge on this topic that's on the committee. And I know we're going to continue to hear from people, and that would be incredibly helpful. What I have been thinking they could be very, very useful for, and very interested in hearing others' views on this, is helping us to write up what it is, what we are hearing, and then helping us to write up the recommendations and the bases for those recommendations. So, right, I at least feel like I don't personally have the time to gather all of my thoughts on paper in a coherent way after each of these meetings. And so I'm not thinking like as a note taker, I'm thinking like actually like summarizing the information and what we've learned from it. And then as we use that information to formulate our recommendations, that they could be useful in helping to sort of write those up and write out the bases for those, which we would then use, right? I'm not at all suggesting that then that becomes the final document, right? But it could form, having done work like this in the past, I know how intensive it is to actually like write it up and then edit it and think through, what do we really want to say here? What do we really want to emphasize? What are the important points? And so if impact justice could sort of give us a draft of sorts, and then we could use that to modify it and edit as a group, it struck me that that could be incredibly useful.
Oh, and just so you know, I'm taking running notes so we can track all of your feedback. Others?
I second that.
I think additionally, we can continue to have them to inform our group with their research and the practices that they already have, collected and established within the community, just based on their work and their research. And I think that would be really helpful for adding value to the conversations that we're having, and then also helping us to really think about practices and strategies that we may not have considered yet, or even, learning from lessons where, there may have been things that they've tried before, and we can at least start with some lesson learned about, their work that they've done previously.
I think one of the key pieces for me that I thought that they could fill in was sort of what Blaine's already done for us with this particular summary of data. That's how I imagined their role, is like really synthesizing data to help us get as much information as we can in such a short period of time, to then use that, to further our discussions and then to help us figure out our recommendations. So I was trying to think what sort of additional kind of data or even anecdotal information that we might want them to collect for us, because, there's only so much time we can actually hear directly from people, and I absolutely want to maximize that. But I also want to maximize like the number of voices that we get to hear from, and so I was thinking like what kind of data maybe is held at the school level or DCPS level that maybe they can get for us and then synthesize, for example, like the arrests that happened at school or on school grounds last year, like if they can get a breakdown of like what those actually were for, what happened during them, whether any children were like assaulted, or sort of more of the like give us a better understanding of what actually happened rather than just like the numbers. I think that kind of information would be helpful for us to understand. I don't know if that's actually kept or aggregated in any way, and I know that they mentioned on Monday they're not planning to do any original research for us, but that's the kind of role I imagine them playing for us on committee.
Others?
Go ahead, LaShonda.
No, I was just asking for more from people, so go ahead.
For me, something really specific that I think would be helpful is in particular thinking about where we just heard from with the advancement project and still exploring police-free schools. We do know that there have been at this point about 24 jurisdictions that are like very recently, but that still have taken steps to remove police from schools. And so while I don't expect data as in like the results of that, because it doesn't exist, it would be helpful for them to do some research to see specifically what, like that looks different in every jurisdiction. So specifically, what did they do and what did they have to do in terms of like the approach? Was it legislation? Were there specific like restrictions or limits in that? Did it go through, like, was it budgetary? Just to give us an idea, I think last week we were talking a lot about like strategy and objections and things of that nature. And so one way we can learn is through seeing what went on in those other jurisdictions. And so that feels like a pretty immediate ask that we can get them started working on.
Anyone else with other ways we want to utilize them? Mr. Hampton, you're off mute.
Yes, ma'am. I did. How are you all this evening? How you doing?
Decent.
I think they can be, and I'm looking forward to working with them. I think they can be very helpful because I know this has been going on for a long time, and they seem to have been involved in some of this kind of stuff, and so they have an idea about what it is. What we can glean from them is the information that has taken place, say, in other municipalities, how they have dealt with it. For example, you know, there are other school systems who have gotten rid of school security people, and those security people now are classified different. They provide a different function, and they have a different set of duties and responsibility, and they're helping with taking care of students and whatnot. So I'd like to know what that is, because I really don't have any trust and confidence in DCPS that they're going to do this. I think that they're going to settle for keeping them in the same vein pretty much, maybe without a uniform, but you know, in the ultimate, I think that's a waste of talent, a waste of resources. The other part about it is that what has happened in the in the school movement around security issues. For example, I know for a fact that, and I go all the way back to Columbine, I know for a fact that after Columbine was over with, they didn't put metal detectors in their school. They didn't put x-ray machines in their school. Now, why didn't they do that? Why wasn't they gripped by the fear and the things that had happened in that school as a result of whatever that student was? And although I know that there's other systems that have reacted and was gripped by the fear and reacted very differently. And so I feel like my experience in doing this kind of work for the length of time that I have made me aware of certain things, research, written, and other things. So I'm looking for that information that will substantiate, but broaden my thoughts on this whole process. But I will personally share with you all, I don't think police ought to be in the school. And I think that that the security guards ought to be retooled and utilized for the skills that they have, because right now, even as security guards, they are providing skills and experiences for our students every single day, and they are not in the context of being security guards, the things that they're doing. So why not lift them up and use those skills and classify them for what they are and do it. But I just think the vast experience and knowledge that they bring, that we can utilize that in our decision-making process in terms of what we're going to do. And then lastly, I would say, well, in those other systems that they've had some experience with, what has been the challenges and the resistance to completely implementing what it is that we're going to recommend? Because there is resistance. And there will be resistance, and then there are folk who are going to out and out challenge what it is that we're going to come up with. And so part of our job is not just to come up with these things, but to make sure that they get fully implemented. So what is and what has been their experience with that part of the work that we have to do?
Thank you, Mr. Hampton. Others?
Yeah. So two things. One is I want to repeat, I think, something Sultan said. And I should ask when he's here, but I feel like I hear different pronunciations of his name, so I apologize because I know I'm sometimes pronouncing it wrong. But Sultan mentioned wanting to know what the obstacles are to removing police from schools very specifically, like what would structurally and sort of mechanically need to be done in DC. And so I don't want to forget that. I thought that was a really important piece to sort of like, what are the steps we'd have to walk through? And I think having someone help us with that would be useful. I know that's sort of along the lines of what others have said. The other issue though is I think for many of us, we are convinced that we can have safe schools that don't have armed police in them, and we can have schools that support learning more if you replaced SROs with counselors and things of that nature. But I don't think, I think we all know that not everyone, probably not everyone on our own commission is convinced of that. And I think we still have to make that case that it's not just how we go about doing this, but that this is the right direction to go. And I think we increase the likelihood that we go that direction if we make that case. And towards that end, I think it would be and I think the Columbine example is interesting and important, but I think the response will be, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, schools that are neighborhoods where there's violence every day. And so I think that it would be useful to have them gather some data about other school systems that have similar rates of everything like that we can find that are sort of similar, and show what and tell us what the numbers show in those districts when they have police and when they don't. And then I'm sure that information already exists and I just don't know about it, but I think it would be useful to be able to demonstrate, because my understanding from what the little information I do have is that you get all sorts of things, and it doesn't really seem like having the police in or out of schools is really the be all end all in terms of school safety. So I think that kind of comparison would be useful to that really necessary first step of demonstrating that this is the right direction to go in. And then I think the second piece of that is if they could help us figure out what other things we might want to be able to show, or might be able to show, and help us gather that data as well, to demonstrate that we can safely move in this direction and actually create schools that are safer and more conducive to learning for students. I just feel like because many of us, I think, are ready to go there. I don't want to forget that we've got to bring everybody else along to get them on the same page in terms of trying that.
And,
Go
and
ahead.
I would just add to that, Christy, and I know that I may be beating a dead horse on this, but also I think that it's important that so in that context, thinking about building obviously better and safer schools without police in them, but also safer communities, right? So youth are not just policed in school. I know that is, a huge part of what we're talking about here, but I also, just want to continue to remind us that part of our mandate is looking at youth who are policed and in various contexts here in the district. So
Yeah.
I would like for them to so part of that is, talking about, why police contact for young people is traumatizing and harmful, period. Like in school, it is, in the community, it is, when they're walking down the street, it is. And so how can we expand what we're thinking about when we're thinking about like what safety looks like for young people, both in school and also when they're just in their communities as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for reminding us of that, LaShonda. You've been so good about reminding us of that. And I do keep going back to the schools issue, but you're absolutely right. And I was actually careful when I spoke with Chris Henning, when I asked her to come on your behalf, on this committee's behalf, and reached out to her. I said, remember, we want to hear about youth in schools, but also police and youth outside of schools. And she's like, well, that's good because there's a whole lot of that we need to be talking about. And so along those lines, one of the things I was hoping that Chris could do, and then also Impact Justice, is to kind of help us prioritize. I think that, there's going to be so much to do. And even if we want to put everything in the report, I think it's like, just realistically, it's going to be useful to have a couple, maybe not a couple, maybe 5, whatever it is, but like certain priority areas for each committee. These are the things that we really think are most important. And clearly one of those for this community is going to be youth in schools. Like, since, that will be there, but there are probably at least 2 or 3 or 4 other.
Lost her.
Christy, we're losing
Cut
you.
out
We're
for me.
lost
Was
you.
that just me?
No, it's Christy.
Okay. Hopefully we can get her back.
So while we're waiting,
But Samantha, I think you were going to say something.
I was.
Yeah.
2 points. So I did want to respond to Christie's around this need and this desire of like examples of school districts that are similar to our own that has done this. And I want to continue to repeat that there is not a lot of data there. Like, there's just not. And so this urgency that many of us as like social scientists, as lawyers who like rely on this type of data to prove our points, we're going to have to push past that. As someone who's been doing this work for the past few years consistently, I'm telling you the data is extremely limited. And for us to get comfortable in using the data that we do have that says it doesn't work, right? There is lots of data that tells us it doesn't work, and it tells us why it doesn't work, and really trying to create the narrative there. And there's also a lot of data around what does work, not necessarily comparing removal of police to inserting X, Y, and Z. This is the change that we see, but it does say when we have counselors, when we have violence interrupters, when we have all these other models that we're promoting, that we can say that those work, and not just reacting to violence, not just reacting to crime, but preventing it from the start and creating more positive school environments. So I just want to continue to repeat that we need to loosen up and unlearn some of those needs that we have for that type of data. I also wanted to suggest that one way Impact Justice could potentially help is in all of these areas with youth justice, so youth policing more broadly, and school policing. There are a lot of recommendations that folk in DC have already been drafting and have been working on. There's a lot of information out there, and we have a lot of public testimonies just from this past year. I would love to see them like go through those public testimonies, and Black Swan has been collecting a lot of them, so it could be an easy transfer, and I'm sure there's others. But to go through some of those testimonies to start building, I think Emily was saying it, like, what is the recommendation, and then what is this grounded in? And so I can see us, right, pulling the testimonies from today, right, like Eduardo from Georgetown and Kathy from SHAPE and Harold from ACLU had a lot of clear recommendations and a lot of like grounding in those recommendations that we can just start like pulling from, so that we can still root it in like a local analysis. And I think I personally do not want to comb through all of those testimonies, but I do think that is a great way for us to also honor the work of people here in DC and let that ground us in our recommendations.
Yes, I'd like to echo what Commissioner Davis has said. And that is, let's not get caught up in the data of finding out what has worked or what is not working in these other larger jurisdictions. If we're moving in a direction that we're going to remove the police from the schools, then I think we should be creating a model. What does that model going to look like? And that's where. But if we're going to do research on other data, and a lot of that data does not exist, then it seems to me that where we would spend our time with Impact Justice is creating what is the model, what are they going to look like going into the future, and then we can build, the research around that in terms of how it performed over a period of time. So I'd just like to echo what Commissioner Davis said with respect to let's not go out and try to find a lot of information and a lot of data. And we can, but if we're going to use that as a conclusion, it may not work in our go forward path going forward.
Yeah, I
And
think
I-
that.
Ms. Hill, may I add this, please?
Oh, yeah,
If you
please.
give me a minute. Can I add, to what extent is what we're going to have to do with the juvenile justice system? I think we need to think about that, because there's some things that happens in the juvenile justice system that manifests itself in the way police youth and way things are handled in the school, like the number, for example, of like the fact that that students in Easton was overly exposed to the police serving custody warrants at the school.
Mhm.
That's a result of what happened in the juvenile justice system. That wouldn't have, the fact that custody warrants and we had some students who, even though there were issues, personal issues that they were going through, they were still thoughtful enough to want to be in school. But the serving of the custody warrant was a result of the juvenile justice system. So I would think that some of the things that we're going to ultimately end up doing, we also may need to be talking about to what extent the juvenile justice system need to be adjusted as it relates to this to accommodate what it is that we're going to be talking about and recommending, because it is in need of repair.
Quick question for Commissioner Hampton. As a former police officer, is there are alternatives to serving those custody warrants? Do they just have to be served?
No, they don't have to
in
be
the
served.
schools? In schools?
No, they don't have to be served. What a good youth detective would probably, if I was a youth detective, I would do my homework and try to figure out where the youth frequents and other kind of things in terms of his or her movement, and then serve the warrant on them then. But I wouldn't do it in school, because again, if this young man or woman is thinking enough to find themselves in school while they're having personal issues, then they have some priorities, as well as having some sense of what direction they need to be going in to get their life straight. So I wouldn't be going to school to arrest them in, and so you can arrest them in other places. All you just need to do is do a little work, that's all.
So I think that actually is a really good question for this committee, and how we want to, and I think perhaps it gets to one of the other points in just prioritizing the issues that we want to focus on, but not forgetting that intersection with, DORS involvement or justice system involvement, how that impacts, a young person's contact with the police, especially when you're serving custody warrants and things like that on school property. Do other commissioners have thoughts on that? Or beginning to, or even in thinking about with impact justice, the type of information we would want to get to inform how we want to prioritize that issue?
Well, again, I think that's a decision that DCPS could do. DCPS could make a decision that they're not going to permit police officers to serve custody warrants in the school. So that's all they need to do. And then they won't get served. They just have to not cooperate. If DCPS was truly in the business of educating their students and caring about their education, then they wouldn't be interrupting it by allowing the police to come in and arrest them. That's easy.
I agree. One of the things that Black Swan has, and others, not just Black Swan alone, but we have been talking about is what does it mean for a school to be a sanctuary, right? And that includes for us, that means that police presence isn't there, because we know police presence, especially when we're talking about undocumented youth, when we're talking about court-involved youth, police simply do not make that a welcoming environment. That does not feel like a sanctuary. But it does also include NPD, even after we remove SROs from schools, that NPD are disarmed, and that if officers are going to a school campus and they cannot carry, that does include that there are not arrests made on school campuses. And so there are very specific things that we can do in addition to removing police from schools that get at this kind of like interaction of that school to prison pipeline, that make that school to prison pipeline a thing. I know Georgetown Juvenile Justice and actually DC Justice Lab with Patrice, who's a fellow commissioner, is doing a lot of work around that, as well as like Miranda rights and consent searches. So absolutely think that should be a priority of ours.
And I've, in talking to Patrice about some of that work, they're very open to coming and sharing with this committee and sharing some of their reports. I know DC Justice Lab and Georgetown have one specifically on Miranda that could be really helpful here. So I've made a running list of some of the things that commissioners have mentioned. So just really quickly, I'll just run through them and folks and tell me if there's something that's missing. So one is that we would like for them to provide support around just creating meeting summaries and notes to collect our takeaways and also to be able to track on an ongoing basis as we're learning things, what some possible recommendations could be and what our thoughts are on that. So just helping to provide information on all the takeaways from all of our conversations and meetings. And then second is to provide us with research on best practices, specifically on why the harm that policing does sorry, hold on one second. My mother is calling me. Why policing youth is harmful. And then we also want, in following up to the previous meeting, what is essentially sort of like a power map of what it would take to be able to implement reform in DC. I know, Chrissy, you mentioned this is, one of the things that Sultan had brought up in the previous meeting, like what are the levers of change, whether it's the budget, the council, who makes what decision. And then fourth, being able to summarize DC specific information. So what I have under that is specifically DC specific data related to youth and policing, but also being able to gather and summarize for us what has already been recommended and thought about and by DC-based organizations and advocates, and to be able to summarize those specific recommendations for us so that one, we're aware of, what is already being considered and on the table and has already been thought through, and that can help to inform the recommendations that we create. And then 5, focusing on providing us with information on strategies and lessons learned from other jurisdictions. So understanding that many of the reforms and work that's been done is relatively recent, that we want more information on what recent reforms have happened in other jurisdictions, how did they do it, but also what are some of the challenges and resistance that they encountered that we might need to anticipate here in DC. And what are some of the challenges to reform and implementation that have happened in other places. And then finally, a focus on helping us to actually draft our recommendations and get to the end game, which is the final report. So ongoing, asking them to help to both collect recommendations as we develop them and to begin to draft them so that we have a starting point. We're not sort of just starting from scratch once we get to the recommendation process. So those are the six points that came out of this conversation that I took notes on. Is there anything that doesn't reflect what we have talked about? Anything that I'm missing? Samantha and I also can, share this with the committee, on paper after the meeting. So you don't have to remember all 6 of them, but is there anything here that I'm missing? Okay, cool. All right. So we have that for how we want to interact with impact justice. And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Really quick question before we keep moving forward. Where is impact justice? I thought they were supposed to join in all our committee meetings.
That's also a good question. Are they going to join for future meetings?
Yeah, they are going to join future meetings. They just sent the list of folks who are going to be supporting the committees today. So I input all their information into the system. So I didn't figure they would be able to join this meeting, but the next meeting they'll definitely be here and supporting help. So
okay,
I think also just for Samantha and I, it would be good to connect with them before they should just come to the.
Yeah.
Now that we know, we can connect with them and
Yeah, and I gave them your contact information, both of you, and all the different co-chairs of the committees, so that way they can connect with you prior to those meetings. So, and they said they would be doing that. So if you don't hear from them, let me know. Happy to circle back.
Awesome. They'll be super excited when they get our long list of requests before they even came to their first meeting. So, all right. So thank you all so much for engaging that conversation. It was really helpful. Like I said, I made notes of everyone's comments, so we'll be able to share them with Impact Justice and get the ball rolling. So I will hand it off to Blaine and his pretty impressive analysis and documents that were shared with you beforehand. He's going to provide to you just sort of a top line of his analysis, and then we'll have some questions for him, and then we'll hand it off to Samantha to introduce our guest speaker when she joins. But thanks so much, Blaine.
Yeah, Blaine, before you do that, I just got a text from Kathy. She says she doesn't have a link to come on, okay?
Okay, I'll resend.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you everyone, and I appreciate the reason I started doing this analysis is because I felt like our conversation at one of the last meetings, people wanted to dig a little bit deeper into it, into like staffing levels and sort of how that compares and what the predictors are. So I started doing some work, and I looked at every DCPS budget, which is 114, I think, and collected data on everything I could possibly get, which I've also shared with everyone. So hopefully if you haven't seen it already, please feel free to dig in. It's all publicly available information, so it's not something that is, restricted or anything like that. But what I did was looked at every budget and took the number of full-time equivalent psychologists, counselors, and social workers at each school, and then also the number of security guards that are employed at each school per MPD's list that they had in their last school safety report. And so I looked at the extent to which schools meet these, which I hope everybody can see the Word document here, meet these sort of staffing criteria. Professional organizations have recommendations for staffing. So the school counselor is one counselor for every 250 students. National Association of School Psychologists is one psychologist for every up to 700 students. And then the Social Work Association is one for every 250 students. And I'll just kind of go through this. So I looked at attendance counselors and guidance counselors. There's some overlap, a little bit of overlap with some of the work that they do, but attendance counselors, of course, are not providing guidance on career pathways or anything like that. They're focused primarily on attendance and academic achievement. And then social workers and psychologists. And this is all information that's in the paper that you can look at. So I'll just get into some of the overview here. First off, so there are 328 security guards at DCPS schools for a ratio of 165 students for every one security guard. There are 212.5 full-time equivalent social workers, which means there are 254 to every student, or 254 students to every social worker, and 102 psychologists, which is 529 students to every one psychologist, and then 153.5 FTE counselors, which is 352 students for every one. So as you can see, we don't, broadly speaking, DCPS doesn't meet the standard for social workers or counselors. They do meet the standard for psychologists. But I'll just note that what this sort of overview data doesn't show is that there are 33 schools without a full-time equivalent psychologist, and there are 51 schools without a full-time equivalent counselor. And you're talking about roughly 13 to 20,000 students then who either do not have a psychologist, a full-time psychologist on staff, or do not have a full-time counselor on staff. And there's one school that actually does not have a full-time social worker, psychologist, or counselor, which is Burville Elementary School, I believe in Ward 7. Once you dig into it a little bit more, so this is the percent of DCPS schools that meet this criteria. 29% of schools out of the 114 meet the criteria for the Counselor Association, which is 250 for every 250 students for every one counselor. 71% of schools do not. 62% meet the National Association of School Psychologists standard, and only 38.6% meet the Social Work Association standard. So broadly speaking, schools are doing better on the psychologist standard than anything else, and the counselor standard is a lot lower. And then just as a note too, obviously we have 45 schools out of the 114 that are part of an SRO beat or cluster. This is just DCPS schools. SROs also do work with charter schools as well. So that's something that folks will want to consider. And 13 of those schools do not meet the psychologist ratio. 20 schools in that SRO beater cluster do not meet the student to counselor ratio, and 16 don't have a student to social work ratio that meets the standard either. And then just taking you through some of this, this is by ward. I did some geographical analysis and looked at, whether they meet standards by ward. There's not a ton of correlation between this in terms of geographic location and whether or not they meet a particular staffing standard. As you can see, like Ward 3 actually has some of the lower numbers. Ward 6 has the lowest on the Counselor Association standard. But all the schools have relatively low for both the counselor and the social work standard. Most places do not have a majority of schools that meet those standards in their ward. And then I just noted that wards and SRO beats or clusters don't seem to have much of a correlation either. That doesn't mean that there's other things that could be happening. And one thing that I'll note is that I wasn't able to get at the moment, it's something I'm hoping to do maybe a little bit later, but neighborhood crime level data, which is not in this analysis. So I can't speak to that, but the other thing I looked at was demographics. So whether or not a school meets the standard by the percentage of at-risk students in the school. For folks who aren't aware, at-risk is a designation in the DC code that denotes a student may be at risk for academic failure, and it's based on basically whether or not they're homeless, in foster care, or if they receive public benefits. And that would be through like SNAP, TANF, et cetera. As you can see, there's generally the psychologist standards, a majority of schools meet that when they have a higher at-risk population, which is what you want. But the social work standard kind of varies a little bit as well, and nobody's really doing good on the counselor standard. Samantha?
I'm going to admit I did not read all of this. I really appreciate you putting it together there and walking us through it. So this might be in here. I know that one of the numbers that we often use has been for when we're talking about social work, the National Association for Social Work. They did have a different standard when we specifically are talking about schools or students with intensive needs or who have a larger at-risk population. And that one is like for every 50 students, one social worker. And so curious to know if that played in at this at all, and or like why we are shying away from that.
So we're not shying away from it.
Okay.
I just haven't been able to include it yet, but that's a good point. And it's something that we should definitely be considerate of. It's just, I haven't been able to get that far in the analysis yet. This is sort of a first draft, but definitely want to look into schools with a higher percentage of at-risk, whether or not they meet that standard.
Awesome.
Appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you. I was more so curious because I also know I haven't seen that updated since like 2013. And so I was just curious if there was a specific reason. Thank you.
Blaine, I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. So this data comes from DCPS?
So the staff data comes from DCPS. The demographic data comes from the Office of State Superintendent of Education. They do their report cards, and those report cards contain demographic data on at-risk, race, English proficiency, all that stuff.
Right. And my next question is one, did you look at the individual school budgets?
I did, but I didn't analyze it for purposes of this particular analysis. Because the budget for a FTE social worker and a psychologist is the same. I think it's $109,100 per FTE. But I can definitely, the numbers are there. I just need to put them together.
So let me tell you what I'm thinking. I work in a school. Well, I had part of my job, I work in the school. So I'm thinking of a school now. It's an elementary school. It went from being an education campus to an elementary school, pre-K 3 through 5 now. And they have a little bit over 500 students. I can tell you they almost have a social worker for every grade. Now, that would exceed the information that you're talking about here as it relates to what the National Association of Social Workers say should be in school. So how does this, and I've had experience of serving on LSATs and all of that kind of stuff. And I know when we're talking about budgets, the principals have a great deal of flexibility when they want to move someone from in a position where that they can put that person in a position and that they would be, it may be mixed, it may be not classified necessarily, but the person is in that position providing that service. But the position that the person is in is going to be different than what, say, that the person should have been. Let me get an example. A assistant principal. If a principal wants to have one assistant principal rather than 2 assistant principals, then she can give that position to a social worker. And she already got 2 social workers in the school. So that school now has 3 social workers. So does this analysis take that into consideration that some of the individual schools have fixed their budgets to accommodate what they know is different on the ground actually in the school than what, say, DCPS actually would want, because they have that flexibility at the school level when we're talking about budget and position?
So no, in the sense that it's hard to parse out sort of how they allocate staff. I don't know if they do like an analysis of student needs, if they do, any sort of analysis of how those needs would factor into making the budget. So like if you're having social workers and you say you need 3, like what metrics are you using to say that you need 3? And that's something that I think we would have to ask DCPS and maybe some of the schools about, because it's something that I personally couldn't find any information on in terms of sort of their thought process.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's going to be internal information by school, because they're going to be looking at not just attendance records, but they're also going to be looking at their community needs, internal disciplinary data, relationships, things that have happened that they are aware of, to be able to make those recommendations based on individual campus need budgets. And the principal does have a lot of authority in guidance in that decision-making process.
Yeah, this is very rich data. We'll be understand that the principals and will make decisions pursuant to its schools along with the parents' organization. But the information here is very rich. It would be interesting if the information where we have deficiencies, let's say if we were in an ideal situation, what would be the cost, overall cost of providing those services? Because part of our report will be, in our report, we will be impacting budget, right? And so if we take this rich data and we said, okay, here, if we were to meet the national standards in each of the 4 categories, I think 3 categories, what would that cost look like? And then it would have to be distributed, obviously, based on need for schools, but what would be the overall budget that would be required of this school district to meet those standards? And were we to meet those standards, how will that impact results for working with students, and in terms of, you know, their, not only their needs, but from a safety standpoint?
Yeah, definitely. And that's something I want to be able to dig into a little bit more. I just want to go through some of this other data really quick. And then, of course, happy to answer any other questions. But as far as at-risk populations, I also find that schools with higher at-risk populations have a lower student to security guard ratio, which means they have more security guards. I don't know that anybody's probably surprised by that, but it's still something that needs to be pointed out, because these kids are dealing with a lot, and to have heightened security can be sort of re-traumatizing, particularly if it's security that you know, treats them as though they are suspects of any kind. The last sort of demographic categories I looked at were regarding race and disability status. So I looked at the percentage of Black students in a school, and, you know, whether or not they meet the standards, because we know that race factors into discipline and security. We know that disability status factors into that. And so being really conscious of that. Again, we sort of find similar to what we found with that risk, in that schools with a higher percentage of Black students have a greater likelihood of meeting the National Association of Psychology's standard, but not necessarily the counseling or social work standards, since those are kind of flat across the board. And then it's sort of the same with disability status. The percentage of students with a disability is correlated with sort of a higher percentage of schools meeting the standard for staffing ratios for the psychologists, but not for counselors, and somewhat for social workers, but not entirely. One thing I did want to note is that even though there's sort of a, you know, some of these associations and correlations aren't super strong, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not strong in general, because there are things that I may not be able to have accounted for in this data. So I just want to throw that out. I did do some correlation analysis. I won't bore you with the technical aspects of that, but it just finds that arrest rate and violent incident rate correlate more with staffing ratios than demographics do. And the arrest rate and violent incident rate for each school was pulled from Aussie data. They post that for every year. Most schools didn't have much in the way of violent incidents or arrests, so it's kind of surprising that it was as highly correlated as it is, even though it's still sort of a moderate correlation. And then to sort of cap things off, I did since I'm a data geek and researcher by heart, did a logistic regression, which if you have questions about, I'm happy to talk about in more detail. But the key takeaways here are that when you control for a bunch of other factors, what we find is that for security guards, if the school is part of an SRO beater cluster, then there's less security guards on staff, which is not really super surprising, but it's a finding that was really robust. Likewise, if there are more counselors, there are less security guards, which also kind of makes sense intuitively. For counselor staffing ratios, you know, some of the demographics here, so percentage of Black student population was significant, which means that they're more likely to meet the professional standard for a counselor association of 250 to 1. Same with, or not same with, but violent incident ratios or violent incident rate and security guards actually increase the likelihood that they don't meet the standard. And then the social work model, fewer things are robust there, but it's still sort of similar. Higher percentage of the Black student population, you're actually more likely to meet the standard. But with the students with disabilities, the higher the percentage, the lower likelihood you have of meeting the standard. And that's the same for violent incident rates as well, which is an interesting finding because you would think that violent incidents would correlate more with more resources, or at least they should, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And that's same with the psychology ratio. It's sort of similar across the board. The limitations, of course, is that I don't have neighborhood level variables, and there may be other school variables that I can't account for. So like the violent incident data that OSCE posts is only violent incidents that result in disciplinary action. So it's not every violent incident, because there are probably some that don't result in official discipline. And certainly there are plenty of incidents that go unreported, I'm sure. And then, of course, you know, none of this speaks to the experience of students in these environments, which I think is really crucial to keep in mind that, you know, we can do this data analysis and it's great, but it's also not something that can speak to the experience of Black students, disabled students, you know, at-risk students who are in these schools that maybe have more security guards or have an SRO designated to them. And so that's just something that I want to sort of uplift. And then, yeah, if you're interested, I have links to all the charts in here, so you can look at them and pull data and do all of that. And I have a map that I'll send around too that's interactive that I put together that has all 114 schools with every data point I can find. So yeah.
Did I look at this, does the data take in consideration the resources that are allotted to schools if they fall in the Title I category?
Not at the moment, but I can dig into that.
Because Title I schools get more resources.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a variable I can include. It may or may not change the analysis, but
right.
Certainly.
Right.
I blame Christy was kicked out of the system. Can we get her back in?
She's on.
Oh, she's on.
Thanks.
Good.
I think she's muted though.
Yeah, sorry, I'm back. I'm just keeping video off, and hopefully that'll keep me from getting kicked off again.
Yeah. Can we, Blaine, this is a terrific report, and I definitely want to spend more time on it. Do we know how student performance relate to the disparities, and particularly the last chart that you showed? We should be able to align student performance to either the NAEP scores or the whatever the district uses with respect to its, you know, testing.
Yeah, that was going to be part of my next piece of analysis, was digging into some of that performance data to see how security guard like ratios and things sort of impact that, because I think that's a really important piece too.
Yes, I'm.
Go ahead. Sorry.
As What are we hoping to see? Like if we do look at that performance data in terms of the correlation? Because I know when I look at this data, none of it is super surprising to me, right? But I think that there's also a larger story that's missing, and that's not necessarily in this quantitative data, and it's in the qualitative data that's missing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I
So
think
how
that's,
do we, yeah, so how do we include that? Because I mean, from the history of criminality for just minorities, like we already know that we can look at this and it's going to be a very dismal report, and it's going to be, it's going to answer for some this question and really speak to why it's necessary that we have, police in schools. And we're also missing, though, a large story where experiences, growth in those areas, looking at, data, more recent data. It's a lot of qualitative information that's missing.
yeah, no, absolutely. And that's something that I think I prefaced throughout, was that this doesn't account for the student experience in terms of how they navigate this environment. And I think that's really crucial. I just wanted to provide this because I think it's important for folks to know sort of where the resources are going and how that compares to what professional organizations are recommending, particularly when we're talking about creating, a more safe school environment for students that is more supportive with more counselors, psychologists, and social workers. So I do agree, though, that qualitative is really important. And I think folks like Samantha have been really lifting that up. So
I wanted to ask, and I'm mindful of time, and I see Kathy has joined us, trying to get to a next step with this piece. And Blaine, thank you so much for putting all this together. This seems like a passion thing for you, like you really like this and you're kind of wonky about it, which I feel, because I'm also wonky about certain things. But it also seems like something that we can get impact justice to do. And so wanted to just ask you if this is something that you want to continue to dig into, or if this is something LaShonda and I should add on to the running list of tasks that impact justice should dig deeper on.
I think I can just continue to dig in on it. I'll definitely work with impact justice because I don't want to leave them out, obviously, but and they can look at the data any way they want, because we have the Excel spreadsheet has everything in it. So, but I'm definitely happy to share and work with them too.
Okay.
Blaine is having fun, clearly.
I know, you tried to downplay it a little bit. Like, I can keep working on it. Okay,
I know.
well, thank you so much for your help doing this. If folks are ready, then, and LaShonda, let me know if this is appropriate. If there were any more comments or questions, I would like to introduce Kathy.
I think Naike, did I see you?
I have clarifying questions, so you can help me read some of this. Because you differentiate sort of in the positions between attendance counselor and guidance counselor, I'm just wondering if that, if the FTEs for counselors is both attendance counselors and guidance counselors, or is there anywhere where you separate that?
For the staffing ratios, I just included both because not all schools have both. Some have an attendance counselor but not a guidance counselor, and some have a guidance counselor but not an attendance counselor.
So that helps me understand better, because in my experience, attendance counselors don't do a whole lot of counseling on mental health and stuff like that. So even those schools might have, and I think most schools have an attendance counselor, if they don't have a guidance counselor who's actually helping kids work towards future goals and all that stuff, it paints a pretty different picture. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Blaine. Thank you, Kathy, for joining us. I've been able to work with Kathy pretty recently around police-free schools, and thank you for testifying today as well. I believe all of the commissioners received your testimony, but if not, we can make sure we circulate everyone's testimony later today. Ron actually made the ask that we extend an invitation, and I jumped right on it, and you accepted right away, so I'm grateful for that. Ron, if you might be better suited to introduce Kathy than me, and so if you would like to introduce Kathy, and Kathy, please feel free to introduce yourself however you would like it also.
Thank you.
Okay.
Before you do that, Ron, let me say, in my attempt to get us out of here by 8, what I have asked Kathy to do was give remarks for about 12 minutes around, Kathy has been, and Ron will say this, but Kathy has been around forever doing this work. And so a portion of her work was around the 2004-2005 decision to create the School and Safety Division. So we'll speak to that. So I asked her to speak to that. And maybe some other things you would like to bring to the table for 12 minutes, and then we will have a time for a Q&A. Okay, go ahead, Ron.
Well, for this for brevity, I'm not going to get into that, other than this is a woman that I've had the pleasure of working with now for some time, and she has a wealth of knowledge, and she's been there. She's also a person who brings people together. Kathy has been in SHAPE. Well, she's the founder of SHAPE. She's also worked with the 21st Century School Fund on 12th Street in the Thurgood Marshall Building. They have a wealth of knowledge and experience and expertise also. So Kathy, take it away.
Oh, thank you. I'll try to make this brief so there's time for questions. And I think the best thing I can bring to you is a sense of how this all started in 2004 and give you a sense of the history of what brought this about. SHAPE, as Ron said, started in 1998, actually, and it started as it's a senior high alliance of parents and principals and educators, and we've actually met every month since February of 1998 with that particular group of the DCPS high school people. And it started because there was a fatal stabbing outside of Wilson in 1998 that followed a number of other stabbings and fatal incidents to students by students at that time. And I think what we'd all been to a lot of funerals at that point, and there was a desire for us all to come together and figure out some common message about what was needed. Was kind of important to realize that time, was similar to this time a little bit, that there was a lot more fear of violence in the city and a lot more, and crime was going up. The high school buildings had not been modernized. There were as many as 100 doors in the larger buildings. The buildings were easily accessible. Someone could open a door from the inside and admit anyone. There was no lighting on the grounds. The staffing was far different than we have now. There were no deans of students, few social workers, few psychologists. However, there was like a peaceable schools coordinator. There were mediation programs, there were diversity programs. It wasn't equal across all schools. The security guards were no longer DCPS employees at that time, but they had started on the contract, and the contracts kept switching. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the security guards were performing, with how they were employed or dispersed throughout the buildings, what their job was. So it always got blamed on MVM or whatever the current contractor was. There were few MPD assigned specifically to schools. For the most part, they were in the police service areas and might be in the vicinity. But then there was a change of staff. Their rotation changed at 3 o'clock. So right when school let out, there often wasn't police officers anywhere near because they were kind of coming on and going off. The enrollment of the DCPS high schools overall was much higher than it is today. And then, just to remember back, Columbine was in 1999. So this is kind of what precursed in 2004 when there was the incident at Ballou, which I think Blaine has given you a lot of history on the exact, legal documents that came out of that. But when that happened, this was the context we were all operating in. And so the high schools, what they requested at that time, what they were lobbying for was a system to secure the doors, lighting, and one school resource officer that would be assigned to each school so that there could be actually a relationship developed between a constant adult. And Czech at that time had a police officer that was theirs and actually coached their basketball team, was kind of part of their community. So people wanted that. And they wanted a student ID system so they could figure out, there weren't uniforms or anything then. They wanted to kind of have a way of knowing who was in their school community and who wasn't. I can't really, I could get for you, I just pulled this together today, when the metal detectors came, they were at some schools, but not at all schools at that time. So the incident at Blue provoked a very quick and swift response from the council in 2004. Like, we've had enough of this, we're gonna bring on MPD. And they were determined to make that change. I think it's worth noting that, like, the high school community at that time, there was a lot of freedom. School staff felt they could speak out, unlike some of the climates that we've had since then at different times. They did not want police officers assigned inside the buildings and in any way in charge of discipline. They wanted discipline to be a learning thing, but they did want police officers available and more responsive when they needed them. It's also worth noting that at the time this change was made, DCPS was in transition. There was an interim superintendent followed by another interim superintendent. So to give you some idea, they didn't even testify at the hearing where this decision was made. It's also important to note that MPD did not want the transfer. They objected to it. So, but the council really felt this was the answer, and they also felt they had to take action, and they had to be seen as responsive to the issues that had come. So, MPD, a man named Gerald Wilson, was in charge of this, the school security, what they were going to be doing. He came to almost all of our meetings. He met extensively with parents and principals. So they did a fairly thorough year-long job of figuring out what this transition would look like and how the policies and procedures should be written up. And it kind of went against my stereotypes. Chief Ramsey was in charge then, was the chief of police. So the kinds of questions that came up that were most pressing, like, well, who was going to be ultimately in charge in the buildings? Would the principals have authority over MPD, or would MPD overrule the principals in certain incidences? And who would get to decide where school security staff was stationed or what their post orders were? And, again, would MPD have precedence, or how would that work? So those were, and then, what types of equipment would be there, what types of weapons were there, all of that, was kind of tried to be fleshed out in the context of buildings that actually couldn't be made secure to begin with. So, the process itself had benefits. I think if we look back at what the assignments were then, you would be surprised to see how many fewer officers and fewer security guards there were at the beginning of this process, even though the population that they were serving was much larger. And I'm most familiar with the high schools, and that's where the largest changes took place, I think, in terms of a sense that the adolescents were the greatest risk. So then 2 years after this, mayoral control came in. And with that, in 2000, 2008, that brought in Michelle Rhee and a focus on accountability and a focus in the schools, kind of at that point, away from what we're talking about now, which is like social emotional learning and a different kind of outreach. It was all about the English and math scores and the ways that we had let our students down academically. And that actually had an impact on the school culture within the schools, in terms of where teachers could spend their time, how much time was available outside of class to be there with students. I think the statistics, if Blaine gets into this, would show a higher turnover between then and now in terms of the stability of the staffs within the schools. So there was a lot of, there's been a lot of changes from 2005 to 2020. So, you know, to pay attention to your time, since, so, you know, coming right up till now, like before the pandemic, in the years since, we haven't had a lot of meetings where security, the SHAPE meetings, where people kind of tell me what's on their mind. Not a lot of them had security at the top of the list after, you know, there was some bumps and all. But this year, prior to the pandemic, prior to all this action, the January and February meeting focused completely on security concerns of staff and students. And this time, the concern was the ways, particularly for the immigrant communities and for the students in feeling threatened by gangs, not to increase police presence, but all the ways that we were failing to meet the needs. You know, we're failing because we don't even have bilingual people in most of these positions. There's not bilingual security guards, there's not bilingual MPD, but also the staff in the schools didn't have places they could turn to get the support that they needed. So this had really started to heat up prior to what we saw in the spring in terms of the transfer and the, so we still, what we're doing right now, it's been really interesting. We held a meeting right away, right through the process when the council was considering this. And there definitely is tension between the fears, particularly of parents in schools that are in neighborhoods where there's a higher incidence around the school. There's not very much, there's a desire to work with school staff within the school, not as much fear of what happens inside the schools as there is with what happens outside the schools. So we've tried to kind of flesh out those fears and have people listen and talk to each other. Definitely everybody wants, you know, I'll just wrap up with the kinds of things we focused on initially is to make sure there's a school level conversation about how to re-envision security, how to make them safe schools, and think about a much broader definition of safety, in how we can really impact quickly the school security contract. And as I said today in the hearing, a lot of concern that the budget process actually starts fairly quickly. And if we don't start this soon, we won't be able to do the staffing at the schools for the 21-22 school year that would reflect a change. And then just kind of concrete things like the way they do arrests in the schools now for custody. And that could be made to stop immediately so that, you know, for sure, if there's an incident that threatens health and safety, that's one thing. But there are now the ability of police to come into a school for something completely unrelated to what's going on in school and make an arrest inside the school in front of other students. So, I mean, I kind of rushed through everything, but I want to give you at least 8 minutes to see if there's any other ways I can help you. And I want, you know, Blaine, I can look over your data and tell you what might be, you know, in terms of someone that's been on the ground and inside these schools for this many years, tell you what you might not have been able to capture, like where incidents might be missing because schools were punished and they look bad on the report card if they put down the incidents and where underreporting took place, and what different positions are filling. There's ways I'd be delighted to help you in your work. So thank you for inviting me, and I fully support what you're doing and look forward to the future. So now we have 8 minutes.
Thank you, Kathy, so much. I saw there are a couple people unmuted now. So whoever would like to ask a question.
We discussed, we spoke earlier about having, making recommendations even before the final report is actually published. And I recall at one of our meetings when Commissioner Davis brought up the issue of police officers going into schools and then the question was asked of Ron earlier tonight. So it seems to me that with enough information and data, that one of our immediate recommendations could be that those, whatever those arrest warrants, wherein police are going into the schools, that could be, that those arrests could be made someplace else. My assumption is, and you all would know, that if the police goes in to arrest a student, it could lead to other issues of between the police and other students who are not part of that. So I just wanted to put that on the table because we did discuss.
Well, and if you do that, it has meant less attendance by immigrant students. Actually, just witnessing that means they will not come back to school.
Absolutely. Any other questions, thoughts? I have a question, but I'd be trying to wait.
Nike, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a question or? Okay.
Okay, so I'm really curious, and another conversation, I can give some greater context to what was also happening. You mentioned Columbine, but there were a lot of things happening federally and local that just really had people buy into this theory of change, that in order to get Black youth to learn, they need to be policed and criminalized, right? The crime bill was 1994. There was billions of dollars flooding into local jurisdictions to get incentivize schools to have formal relationships with policing. And so oftentimes what that led to was more police in Black and brown schools, not more police in the schools where who are more likely to have mass shootings. In fact, Columbine didn't have an increase in police after the shooting. They had an increase in other resources that actually prevent violence from happening in the first place. And so my question to you is, in those conversations, the local conversations, what I see happening now that I'm pleased about is not just like the piece around policing, but about like, how do we actually support the young people? And so were there conversations, even the instance about Baloo, right? Like we know now that the individual who was the perpetrator who shot the young man for months was dealing with bullying and was looking for support. And so curious if there were conversations around investments and around mental health and around social emotional support, or if the policing piece really dictated that conversation.
Well, because it came from the council, it did dictate a lot of it, but the thing that makes me a bit humble about what we're doing now is there was that presence in the schools. There was that concern about having mediation, having other ways of solving problems. They didn't have the staffing that we have now, but I feel like now we have the opportunity to make a much deeper change so that it will not be buffeted by things that happen nationally quite as much. And that's what I'm afraid of, that if we don't do the really deep change, like right now we have more social workers, we have more psychologists, we have counselors, but their work is not coordinated, even inside the building. So that if you listen, to the Young Women's Project that's done a lot of work on this, a student doesn't know exactly where to go for help. They often go to a teacher who doesn't have the list of where they should send a student. So you can have a psychologist sitting in the building and not have all of this happening. So I am leery of just advocating for more personnel without an actual system inside the schools that is embedded and deeply held. Otherwise, staff gets cut the minute we have a budget problem. Classroom teachers can't be cut, so these people go. So it has to be deeper. So to answer, I don't know if that answers your question, there was that discussion in the schools, but it got overridden by the concern in the city to do something quickly. And we didn't have the power.
And that did answer my question. I guess a quick part B would be, were there any actions, any like increased investments or any type of initiatives beyond policing, like more in regards to education equity or social emotional support? Was there any of those things that also took place in that 2004-2005?
Well, that's why I was kind of pointing to, there wasn't any stability at the top in DCPS. There was no leadership at that time that would have put that out there. You know, Vance had a heart attack, and then Robert Rice came in, and then there was just this interim lady from Prince George's County that was there for a hot minute. So none of that came from the top. And then it didn't have any weight. And the schools were kind of reeling. They were reeling from all of this. And so, no, it didn't happen. And then it didn't further happen with mayoral control, because then the whole focus was, it was on equity, but only on, you're not having high enough expectations. We're not evaluating the teachers according to the results on the test. So we went a whole different direction, and not really on the whole child, which is kind of where we're coming to now. But I don't completely trust it unless we embed it far more deeply.
That's right.
Are there other questions? It is 7:59, but there are other questions.
Yeah. Can I ask you, just one thing, Kathy, are there any particular schools in DC that you think do have a more integrated school-based mental health staff, do have a better process where, you know, they're all working together to focus on the whole child that we could see as an example, maybe?
Well, I asked the principal of Anacostia to come to our SHAPE meeting next Tuesday, because they have had a longer history with restorative justice. And he has done a lot both at his previous school and at Anacostia. So he's going to talk to the rest of the principals and teachers and parents. You know, it's not like somebody maybe from every school, but whatever we get, to talk about what's happening there. Ron Brown, from its inception, had a focus on a different way of resolving conflict. Roosevelt is my neighborhood school, and I'm on their LSAT. Which is their local school advisory team. They have done a lot, and they have a high Hispanic population, at least 50%. They have done a lot of work. They're the ones that actually, you know, prompted the meeting in February about how we're not serving the students. So what I can see there is they're trying to pull it together into a coordinated thing, you know, and work with the ELL and with the language problem and with all of that. So I would look at those three, the top three that come to my mind immediately. I would talk to Maria at Czech, who has a long history with this. She's been here as long as I have. But you know, those four I think the principal at Ron Brown is brand new, so I don't know that he would be able to speak about that. But I would say Anacostia, Roosevelt, and Czech could give you some idea of their efforts in this direction.
Kathy, I would also, if you're talking about elementary school, there are a couple of elementary schools, or used to be whatever they used to call education campuses in Ward 4 that have really zeroed in on resources.
Yeah.
Truesdale is one, Brightwood is one. And I mean, that's why I was talking with Blaine earlier about, it seemed like they have a social worker for every grade. They have counselors in the school. Now, I don't know how they've managed to do that, you know, but the principal, like Mignon mentioned, has a lot of leverage when it comes to budget and moving staff and stuff around. And like I said, they provide services for their students. They also are invested in constantly paying attention to the numbers, the stats, the information, all of that. And so Truesdale, Brightwood, and a couple other elementary schools in Ward 4, they really are student oriented and providing the services. And I know because we have services at the collaborative that we are partnering with those schools in terms of also helping to provide services for families. So they would be worth looking at in terms of what are they doing.
You know, the other voice I think would be good to hear, like the public defenders, who especially defend the students with disabilities. They have a very important perspective, and also the kids that are in jail. At the jail, it's really been helpful to us in our meetings that we have someone that always brings up that perspective in the way those students are not served. And so I would And Nikisha Widston is one of our high school parents, and she always brings that to our meetings.
Kathy,
It's important. Go ahead.
I was just going to wonder, and maybe this is a offline conversation or something, but what was different about the South Capitol Street shooting that led to such a different response from council members in particular? Because like the incident Blue, right, leads to the transfer of the contract to MPD and all this other things, but then a shooting that claims, I think, more lives of young people actually ends up increasing, like implementing a law that's supposed to increase like behavioral health supports in schools. And it's just, I always wonder why the response was so different.
Well, you know, in 2004, we had Kevin Chavis. We had he was the one who was head of this. He drove this. Kathy Patterson was much more cautious. It's partly the people. David Catania was a health person, and he was on the council, and he you know, it matters who's on the council and what their priorities are. And, right, you know, that's kind of who we elect and who we're going to elect in 2 weeks. It actually has a big impact. And you know, we've had more funding in groups like the Children's Law Center and other groups that have been able to elevate these concerns as time has gone on, and that helped. We didn't really have that back in 2004. We were kind of alone out there advocating against it. So it's been great that there's a lot more voices. And that's part of it. And part of it is the exact personalities and priorities of the people that we elect on the council.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. And please use me however you can. Samantha has my contact information, and I'd be happy. And on the SHAPE website, I have all the original documents from 2004. So, and we also put up all our minutes and things, and you're all always invited to any of our meetings if you would like to come. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
LaShonda, you want to take us to next steps?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for a really productive meeting. We wanted to also just preview for you what we're hoping to have ready for you in our next meeting. So Samantha has been working hard to, again, you know, as we said before, we want to make sure that at every step of the way we're hearing directly from young people and we're hearing directly from students. And so we are in the process of putting together a next meeting where we'll actually be bringing in young people who have experienced policing and law enforcement contact here in DC. So you can ask them, one, they can share their experiences directly, like how this has shown up in their lives, how it's impacted them. But also you can ask them questions, right, about how police are showing up in their schools and in their communities, and to learn directly from their expertise. We also have been working on scheduling time for also Dean Chris Henning, which we talked about before. I know that Patrice, who's also on the commission from DC Justice Lab, can come in and talk about some of their work specifically on how youth are being policed here in DC. But that's just a preview for you in terms of what we're trying to schedule and coordinate for our next meeting that builds off of some of the pre-readings and things like that we've sent you thus far. Are there any questions about that in particular? Or Samantha, if you have anything to add on that.
Someone else was going to say something before I unmuted.
There's me. It's not a question. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I didn't.
It doesn't look muted. It's okay. It doesn't look like I'm muted because I have to use my phone for the audio. So I'm muting on my phone. So it just always looks like I have something to say. But this time I actually do. With regard to PDS, actually, that Kathy mentioned, so I reached out to a contact at PDS who does who works with the kids specifically at YSC. but also, they're sort of in and out. So young people who are policed and who are part of the juvenile system. And one of their concerns was that they have like quite a few young people and their parents who do want to speak to the committee or the commission as a whole, whichever. But a lot of them are still like in active litigation or there's active cases. So I talked to them about how they might feel more comfortable maybe aggregating some of the anecdotes to hand over like as PDFs rather than having the young people sort of expose themselves because this is so public. So that's something that their general counsel is looking into, and I was going to connect you to Samantha and LaShonda to them so that we can still get their voices without putting the kids and the families at risk of retaliation.
That's great, and exactly what I was about to comment on. For this youth panel coming up, what we really want to do, I have to talk about the importance in this policing conversation around centering the voices of the students who are at the margins of the margins, right? And so being able to create space for undocumented youth, immigrant youth, court involved, or more broadly systems involved young people, right, who are the most impacted by policing, who are most likely not to show up at schools because merely the presence of police, who are getting those custody orders at the schools. And so I have been in conversation with a few folk as well and talked about doing it anonymously. So either having record to the extent that people feel comfortable with the audio recording or doing some type of recording when we don't see face and not using names, then I can work with them separately to make that possible. And then we can just play it as a video to the commission. And if they want to come on, change their name and not come on video to ask questions, I think, Blaine, we can do that too, but definitely want to create a space that feels safe for them. And I'm okay with doing that. So wanted to offer to anyone, I know a lot of you are working directly with young people, directly engaged in systems one way or another. So if you have young people, those are the young people that I think really need to be a part of the conversation. And if you can just connect us to them.
Samantha, is it possible that we could hear from a student who attends Walls, who's never ever had a negative experience, as well as never had any experience with any X-ray machine or police officers in the school, because the guy, the principal there, didn't allow that?
Yeah, we actually organized, some of the students at Walls are some of the most active in our Police Free Schools campaign because they recognize the disparity there. And so absolutely can get young people at Walls. There's another young person who we work with. I don't know if I can hear on the background, I apologize. There's another young person that we work with that goes or went to BASIS, which is a public charter, I think in Ward 1. And she has a really unique perception because she talks about how when she first went to BASIS, it had more Black and brown students there, and there was a culture of policing. And in fact, they had a lockdown at some point for some confusion that was rooted in like lack of cultural competency. And since then, BASIS has changed significantly. And she says she has never in the past 2 years seen police officers or security. So we can talk about that and we can bring some of those young people into the fold. Thanks. Everyone hears that you're done, Cairo.
Anything we need to do, on the Zoom side to help protect students and things like that, happy to do. So
yeah, I was going to say, Blaine, I mean, similar to what, DORS hearings, things like that, when they bring in, a young person or a family member, there's a way to block it out, use initials, all that kind of stuff on Zoom.
Yep. Yeah. Good.
All right. So anything else for the good of the commission, good of the committee before we adjourn? We only went 12 minutes over tonight, y'all. That's a record for us.
It was a fantastic meeting.
Well, thank you. It's fantastic because of all of you and your input and your involvement and your commitment to these issues. So it's been definitely fun to co-lead with Samantha. She's great too. So, all right. Well, if there's nothing else,
all of y'all are.
If there's nothing else, then I think we can adjourn, Blaine.
I think we're good.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
All right. Good night. Good night. Thank you.